Okay. All right, perfect. I think I am all set. All right. Hello. You hear me? Oh, well. Set? Set. Okay, so we will get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just testing microphones. And I can be heard in the front row. So, looking forward to this conversation. There we go. I can hear it now everywhere. Thank you very much. Do you want me to keep talking? All right. Well, we are going to have a very full conversation, and looking forward to it. And in the meantime, I will probably pace around a bit because I can, and I can go point to things. And in the meantime, you just hear me waffling on randomly, but I can hear myself, so that's a good thing too. I could start asking you all questions. That could be fun. How many of you know what I'm talking about with all this? That's good. That's all any of us can do, actually, is out of that. I may borrow that for the intro. All right. House photographer makes his way into the room. Hello, Alain. Good to see you. They've moved from the triangle to the cowbell. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
All right, good morning, everybody. Today's talk, I hope you enjoyed your snacks and everything. Today's talk is AI's explanations as two-way experiences led by users. And today's speaker, his name is Dwayne Degler. He's been a principal consultant at Design for Context for 16 years. And Design for Context is a UX consultancy that has a strong track record of turning concepts and recommendations into user interface designs at work. So we're looking forward to a very exciting talk about a very hot topic these days in AI. So, okay.
All right.
And we will do all our questions at the end of this session, after the talk is done.
All right. Yes, there will be plenty of time for questions, I'm sure. All right. Well, we'll get started. I think there are others I'm hearing will be trickling in. This is a good start. Thank you all for coming. And I really appreciate this. This is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. Trying to figure out how we explain what's going on inside these very impenetrable algorithm black boxes. And so it is something, what I'm presenting today is something that I've been thinking about for quite a while. This is not a absolutely finished, here's how you go do it, and you can start tomorrow and it'll all be perfect. As the gentleman over here had noted in the, as we were talking a few minutes ago about how much do we really know about this and how much do we need to know? Well, how much we know is kind of like this, because there's a lot of algorithmic nuance that we're still trying to figure this out. And I've been working for the last few years with others on looking at methods and approaches for how to work in AI spaces and with AI teams. And I would suggest that you just sort of take it in, because there's a lot of content here. And there is a link here, the Day1Session1 link, UXPA24-XAI. And I will say that the slides, unfortunately, are not showing up on that page when I checked just a few minutes ago. They're up on SlideShare, so you can find them on SlideShare under Design for Context, and the web page is active, but I will have to fix that immediately afterward. So there we go. So let me dive in. As I said, there's a lot of things to cover and think about, and so I think if we can then really get into questions afterward, that'll be great. I've got plenty of time for questions, and I am around for the rest of the week for conversations. So while this is about explanations, I wanted to start a little more broadly about AI generally, just to make sure that we're grounded in where explanations might be useful and needed. I've been working in AI partly, Design for Context is a consulting firm, so I work with some AI organizations. One particularly is a small startup in Sweden where I started doing this work a few years ago, really thinking through what is it going to mean to think about interacting with AI, and what does the user need to do to engage in it and to have some control over the process. And so that's where this comes from. But I really want to make sure that we're thinking about what are we talking about? What's the scope of this? How many of you are familiar with Emily Bender? She is definitely somebody you should pay some attention to. She is one of the 4 authors of the Stochastic Parrots article that was written when the ChatGPT was first coming out. She's a linguist and computational linguist from the University of Washington. Very smart and very sharp in her critique of the limitations of a lot of what we're currently calling AI. And she did a presentation for a congressional roundtable in late 2023 and posted it at her Medium site And as I said, these links are in the presentation, so as soon as it's up and visible, it's all yours. And one of the things that she said there I thought was really important, which is what happens when we replace the word or the term AI with automation. It gives us a much more grounded way to think about the subject. And then she went on to types of applications, characterizing them in less hype-driven languages. So, there's automatic decision systems, which are making decisions on things like, loans and HR and other kinds of things. There's automated classification, has a lot to do with search systems and search and discovery, recommender systems. We know a fair amount about that. Automating access to human labor, things like allocating Mechanical Turk or Uber or Lyft, whatever those come to mind. Translation between forms. So you'll see that with images, you'll see that with machine translation in languages, different forms that change. And then synthetic media machines, which is her phrase for generative AI type things that are creating synthetic readable statements, but they are synthetic language, not necessarily knowledgeable deliberative language. So I just want to flip through these so we can see that it's not just about what we're seeing as the definition of AI at the moment. This is actually AI that stretches back into the 40s. But we're seeing it in things like the internet, search, translation, monitoring content that happens, monitoring for rights and such things. It's embedded in your GPS, in other types of voice assistants. It's been around in type ahead for ages, and we all know both how convenient and how frustrating that is. And in various types of image processing. In your home, you're finding it again through voice assistants, but also your vacuum cleaner and thermostats, your Ring doorbell surveillance systems. It's increasingly in our cars, not just self-driving automobiles, but lane assist, cruise control, the maintenance programming of that. Within our jobs, customer service, HR performance reviews, resume assessment. There's a lot of talk about that right now and the way that that's been delegated out. Our finances, it's been around for ages. It's where a lot of the ethical questions were emerging in relation to AI. Your health. There's a tremendous amount of work being done in the healthcare space. Some of it really, really great, and some of it really, really cautionary. And of course, in society where we're seeing things like facial recognition and aspects of community policing, robotic warehouses. I was actually in a city at one point visiting family when one of the robots accidentally caught fire and ran amok and just ran from rack to rack, burning things down. These things happen. So I want us to think about AI in fairly simple terms. What's actually going on in there? Because that will begin to tell us perhaps where we might be able to influence some of it through design. One aspect of it is expertise. So we have their content, which is an articulated experience being digested by a machine, and contexts, which are what is the framing in which that content exists. So this is particularly prominent at the moment, of course, because of the harvesting of the internet at volume, but any kind of training of systems comes into that. The aim in the training processes of all that expertise is to build models. It's to build models of the world so the AI can interact with users. It builds patterns around the data, builds patterns that it can discover. This is where you see machine learning trained data patterns. You actually I've spent hours looking at hundreds and hundreds of rows of spreadsheets of data and scoring them between 0 and 1 for their validity and relevance to what we want the AI to do. Discovered patterns is where they talk about things like deep learning. And the large language models now are more in discovered patterns because the volume is too great and the end goals of the model shape is not as clear, and so they tend to be discovered by the engine going in and finding patterns itself. Makes them harder to interrogate. And then finally, math. And math, again, ties back to those models. The math is supervised, where you're actually training and supervising its learning, and unsupervised, where the models, where the AI is out there just self-learning. So this might help a little bit as we think about what's going on in here. And if you're called to work with an AI team, what kinds of things are they doing with the data? What kinds of things are they doing, which is going to be the thing that becomes the data content conversational interface with the user? And so for you to be able to know the user side of that picture, we need to be able to very simply qualify what's going on underneath. Explanations. Now we get into the heart of it. Human-to-human explanation is a two-way communicative process in most cases. There are exceptions, but in most cases, there's a give and take. It's iterative. The aim of it is mutual understanding. So you want to make sure that the person receiving the explanation understands the situation and understands the ideas, etc. And so there's the use of language, but there's also the use of things like nonverbal cues, both, whether that's gestures, whether that's quizzical looks, which require a prompting for more communication. And then there are shared contexts. Is there even something simple like the person who's delivering the explanation? Are they talking to one person? Are they talking to 2 or 3 persons? Are they talking to someone who is a patient in a hospital, a caregiver in a hospital, a doctor, a nurse, etc., in that context? Or are they talking to an elementary school student or a high school student or a PhD candidate or a senior researcher? There's so many areas of shared context that are discernible and understandable. And a goal of fostering trust, that the explanation helps build a sense of confidence and trust in the recipient as well as in the person delivering it. Now, in a lot of our work in UX over many, many, many years, there's been a passive form of computer and human explanation that happens. UX research, design processes, we identify things that users need in order to be able to function effectively with the tools we build. Instructions, responding to error states, confirmations. And in order to do that, then the user might need to confirm that they've seen a message. They might need to make choices or provide information that helps the system move to the next steps. And so we're familiar with a very deliberately encoded form of explanation. Now we come to the AI part. I'm going to start with the computer scientist view of AI, which is one way. So it's starting with how can the AI explain what it's doing? How can it introduce transparency into the black box? How can it give you the ability to know what's going on? So computer scientists are working quite hard to figure out, how do we help it elaborate? How do we tell the user what the sources of data are, what content is available, the logic that's being used, different mathematical weightings and processing, whether or not those models have been crafted in the training environment or whether they are self-learning. And that is not always a language description. It might be a visualization, it might be charts, it might be mathematical formulas and tables and that kind of thing. That's the aim, but it's not always effectively baked in to AI applications. When I was looking at this in 2022, I was writing a paper in 2022, and I did some searches back in both the ACM, Association of Computing Machinery Digital Library, but also the archive.org, the pre-publication where a lot of people are putting things out, and was finding between 55 and 75% of the papers had been published in the last couple years, like in a 2-year period, a huge volume. So the computing industry and AI and the academic community kind of woke up and said, whoa, okay, we gotta roll on this. We've got to focus on this. And a lot of papers have been coming out. So this is not for reading now, unless you're bored and you need to go look these up, then they're available. But these were just 4 papers that I thought were interesting because of different kinds of things that I was able to draw out of them. The first one just had broke down a set of explanation types. So things like, what's the difference between a counterfactual explanation and, an elaborated explanation? And, there's varying types of ways that it was presenting argument from linguistics, looking at linguistics and thinking about argument and presentation of that, and built that into a paper. The Gerling's paper is really interesting because they were looking at the use of information and the explanations about healthcare information. And in that particular case, it was fascinating because they were recognizing, hey, this is going to just rock your world, that different people need different levels of information in their explanations. Who would have thought? But it's nice the way they broke it down and they studied it, and not just with like the difference between doctors and nurses and long-term patients and early stage patients, but also like the development team and the stakeholders and all sorts of other people in that area. There is the TED teaching explanation. Is just interesting in the way it tries to present a way to help teach explanation to machines. And the last paper has reviewed a whole series of other papers that had presented taxonomies and flowcharts about explanation. So these are just 4, just an example. There's a lot of literature out there now, but it's all pointed at the machine communicating with the human. So how do we begin to boost up the human also communicating with the machine. And so as we think about it from design terms, part of what I'm thinking about are things in this list. How do we make sure that the machine is actually humble in its presentation, the humble interface? I started looking at the humble interface years before I started looking at AI, but it's important to sort of set the tone of explanations. Be transparent, how the machine recognizes that it needs to know something about context, and then ask questions and elicit information about context. When does it recognize that it needs something in order to be able to give an explanation rather than just be programmed to give an explanation? And these are the things we're going to talk about over the next little while. So I started, as I was thinking about this a couple of years ago, I started laying out some categories for things that I thought might be useful in thinking about, as a designer, how do I think about what it means to design an explanation? What needs to be in it? How do I talk to the developers about it? How do I actually think through and make sure I understand what the parameters of it need to be and what might be needed if I'm training AI? So what I'm about to present is a thinking tool, my thinking tool. You can completely tear it up, turn it over. There's all sorts of different ways of thinking about it, and it's very much in progress. Even yesterday, I was thinking, wait a minute, this bit isn't right here. I'm going to go tweak that and rethink it. I presented a poster at the Information Architecture Conference. How many of you have been to the Information Architecture Conference? A couple of you. It's a great conference. It's really good. It's been a favorite of mine for ages, as has this one. And so I created this big poster that had a bunch of white space on it and had people who wanted to talk to me about this subject, and we were scribbling ideas onto it. And so this is what I'm going to show you today is in some ways transcribed from what I had presented 2 years ago, or I guess it was early '83. And it's a framework. You can change these ideas as much as you like. I laid it out in 9 categories because that fit really well on a poster. And those categories flow from really simple, static-based, sort of rule-based things, communication, to really pretty hard and dynamic and complex information. And so I was going to walk you through these, not in all the detail because you can get access to it, but I wanted to go through, as I said, it starts at the simpler, more approachable level in the top left with instructions and reads across. Instructions we're familiar with, errors and warning messages and multilingual are all pretty clear. Then there's substantive information, contextual information, and multicultural information that when you're using it to explain things, create a lot more nuance. And then we get way down into the very subtle stuff where we're into what does an equitable explanation look and feel like? What about relational aspects and evolving aspects where the machines are learning and evolving over time? So I'm going to go through this and just give you some thoughts and examples because there is a lot there. Instructions, this is pretty clear. This is what is going on here that we need to request from the user or explain to the user how an interface is working and why and what needs to be there. In the details underneath it, you'll see the H/M and the H and the M. That's sort of where the center of my focus is. Is this something where both the human and machine are playing a role in relation to this point? Or is this very much a human-directed thing, or is it a machine-directed thing? And so as we look at these, you'll see those in there. And again, it's better to look at this in detail later and read through some of these and see if some of these make sense. But that's the coding I was using, is sort of which direction, who's the responsible party in this going on. And so here we have things where where what we're doing is building awareness of processes, awareness of requirements. What does quality outcomes mean? And where does it come from? And also then in automation terms, for example, where does the machine monitor what's going on with the user to be able to know when to intervene? Error and warning messages, again, pretty straightforward. So I'm going to skim through these so we have time to talk more in the conversations. And these kinds of things are both about, something's happening, some event has happened in the system. We need to notify the user, and then we need to get input. And there may be a bit of problem solving back and forth that goes on, or the user needs to intervene in some way. Multilingual starts getting interesting because this is where we sort of have to look at not only the translation among languages, but the nature of how languages carry information and an explanation that may mean one thing in one language, another thing that's slightly different in another language. One of the things in here is homographs. Again, the Information Architecture Conference and the taxonomists is interesting, where a word may have multiple meanings, but not in each language. And so depending on what language you're operating in, then how do you think about what should be carried in that explanation? Also, there are things like the speed at which something is presented, the amount of information that's presented at one time due to the level of language proficiency that an individual might have. Substantive, in the second row now, is where the evidence begins to start showing up and where the explanation of situation starts showing up. So this is where you're focused on the subject of the interaction, the subject in which the AI is operating. And that's often where scoring comes in. So where either in the training process, you're scoring the quality of outcomes, or the AI in the process of harvesting and bringing information in and bringing explanation of why something is there, may use techniques like visualizations, charts, or graphs to say, well, this is particularly strong as a signal, and so that is why this was presented to you, because there are other things that are not as strong in relation to it, but maybe we need to present options, and you can tell, the machine, the human can then tell the machine which thing is stronger or not strong, etc. And so this is a dialogue around the substance of the purpose of being there and using a machine in that interaction. So one of the things that's tricky about this is in the explanation, how much do you burden it down with things like the authority of the source material? This is one of the challenges that generative AI gets into. It's like, what's the source material? Where does it come from? Again, referring back to Professor Bender, she and Chirag Shah wrote a paper very recently, it was just published a couple months ago, about the challenges in search where at the moment when you're looking at search results, you can evaluate the result, you can evaluate where that information is coming from, you can look at the individual instances, and as some of the search engine companies are moving towards summarization of search, you lose all the context behind it. You lose the, what is it, that, where does it come from, and how many different sources is it drawn from, et cetera. So there's some interesting things in the substantive side of it. Contextual is very important. As I said, you know, are you talking to one person? Are you talking to three? What role are those people in? What situation? How urgent is the situation in which they're trying to get information from AI? Is there an ongoing sequence of events where this might be something where they looked something up at one point and were researching something at one point, and now we're in a different place and a different point in time? And so the degree to which those contextual clues are available, I think in most of your interactions, like if you think about interactions with search engines, there's very little context that you're providing in your keywords other than some clues about the subject or the way that which one of the, you know, drop down recommended searches you picked might tell you might tell the machine a little more context. So there are things here, again, I don't want to go into a lot of the details, but I will point out in the middle the confirm the understanding of contexts. So what is the situation where the machine is reflecting back and confirming what it sees the context as being? I use a lot of medical examples. I'm not actually working in healthcare at the moment. It's been many years since I did that, but it's an area that I think is very important for these kinds of discussions because some of the other information that may be coming into AI is not actually coming from a base of substantive source material. It may also be coming from other diagnostic tools. And so there's a separate tool that may have done an interpretation of a test or an X-ray or something like that. And that's now being fed into the AI that the user is interacting with. And so the question of how you confirm and understand contexts and sources becomes really important. Multicultural is interesting. How many folks have looked at or studied cultural exchange or intercultural communication? A few folks. This was fascinating to me a number of years ago. I mean, I'd been living in the UK for many years. I spent about 12 years in the UK and was working in training and working in systems design and knowledge management. And so I kept coming across it myself in interpretation of language in those circumstances. And then my mother began working with the State Department in Bosnia when they began to have elections and things like that. And so she was encountering folks there and she met folks from the intercultural communications training world. And it's a fascinating area. It's really worth looking into. There are some things in there that are really important. So culturally, one of them is that I tend to go back to pretty regularly is high context and low context cultures. Are you familiar with that? Anybody familiar with high context and low context cultures? So there are cultures like the US, which is actually a fairly low context culture. There are very few assumptions about the social experience, social etiquettes, knowledge, etc., that people have in an interaction with somebody they don't know. Unlike, for instance, Japan, the UK, and other places where there are norms. The Japanese have a wonderful phrase in there that I've got there about halfway down, reading the air, which is where you intrinsically have a sense of what's going on in an interaction between people. You're reading the air, which comes from growing up in a culture that has a high context. And so thinking about the contextual dynamics of information exchange between humans, and then the question is, should our AI tools be able to recognize any aspects of the communication from the human that gives it a clue as to whether there's a high context situation that it may not be aware of, or whether it's a low context situation where more information needs to be passed, and that sort of thing. Tone becomes important, how you defer, what role you take in communication is something that I think needs to be thought through in the way that AI explains. Equitable is recognizing that there, again, are expectations and perceptions that may not need to be, maybe need not to be assumed in this. We find this particularly, we see it with the anthropomorphism of our tools, where they become, I'm talking to Siri's human-like. Great, and so you begin to think of it as having personality, as having experience, as having emotion. We see it now a lot with generative AI. There's a couple things that we see there, which I'll talk further about in a few minutes. But I want to just say that this idea of AI taking the power position through its declarative language, through the pronouncement of things, it sometimes makes it hard for a person to say, I just need to ask questions about this. I need to probe this further. So giving permission is one of the aspects of that. Relational is, the word in there is longitudinal. So how do you build a relationship over time? A lot of our systems are transactional. You go, you do something, when you're done, you walk away, and it's done. But if you're using AI as a support tool to the work that someone is doing, then they come back, in the case of like a professor, they come back a couple months later and are diving into further research, and then a few months after that. And in the meantime, the trajectory that's happening there in people's thinking and expectations is evolving. And so the relational gives us this ability to think about what happens if somebody's interacting across multiple sessions. What level of familiarity do we build into the language the more that there's an interaction between the parties? And so these are the kinds of things that we want to be thinking about there. And the last one is evolving, because the data's not static. The learning cycles are happening continuously in the background. And so with that, both parties, the human and the machine, need to potentially update each other on what the current state of the information space is, what the current state of the models in use are, et cetera. We have to recognize that outcomes may change. The query that you ask today may actually be getting completely different answers than the one you asked last week. And how do you begin to gauge, how fresh is what the AI is telling you? How recently did it get updated and retrained and evolved? So you have an expectation about it. So that's a whirlwind tour of a very dense subject, but it gives you an idea of some of the areas to grab hold of. So I'm going to finish here by briefly anchoring a little deeper into the elephant in the room, which is large language models. So we were talking about this as kind of a high-level gravitation, a high-level focus. And from the perspective of explanation, there's trained and supervised understanding of explanation. There's the training of those data patterns and models and reflection in models and human AI teaming, which is an important word to be able to look for because there's a lot of really good work being done there, and contexts. Those are the areas that we want to focus on. The challenge is that none of those things actually are how LLMs and generative AI is trained. So, apologies to Allow and the Canadians in the room. But this was from February. Generative AI uses statistics. It's type ahead on steroids. That's what it does. It looks at probabilities that the next words in the sentence, okay, you've got these 3 or 4 words, and the next words, given that in the relation to the body of material that is where the explanation is being made, what will be the highest probability of the assembly of that next set of words in a sentence? And so those word choices are based on patterns of frequency, which come from large amounts of language in a model, LLMs. And they've harvested the internet for that. But your particular position, work that you're doing in AI might need something a little more constrained. And word choices are based on the language that is used to prompt the request for that statement back from generative AI. So the reason that matters is those prompts are going to be an interesting combination. I mean, you've all seen, I'm sure, prompt engineering. And you can imagine variables in those prompts that are then used inside the machine to interact with the requests from the user. But shaping those prompts can get a little tricky. The variables have a lot of context in them and need a lot of context to perform. And you need multiple iterative prompts sometimes to get you to the place you need to be. So that's really what we're looking at, is almost a complete flip in the things that drive and focus LLMs and the things that we posit are needed to effectively create highly engaged and interactive explanation. So that's a tricky problem. Doesn't mean that we can't use those tools in some way. One of my AI colleagues who's been doing this for many, many, many years pinged me when the LLMs were first beginning to hit the ChatGPT, the early ChatGPT stuff. And he says, I've been playing with it, and it's really rough. But the one thing we can say is we've cracked the NLP problem. The recognition of language, at least in English, at least in the Western world, at scale has made it much better at recognizing language. So recognizing what's communicated by humans in questions, in contexts, in other things, could potentially be supported by this. But they really are only able to recognize what the human need for explanation is with specific training. And that's a different part of the process. So those of you who may be deep in the middle of this will know about RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation, which is to use a controlled data set to process the language. And that should potentially be supported by knowledge graphs, which are ontological networks, semantic networks of information that can also carry things like context and such. Now, I will say, back in that example from Air Canada, the answer was on their website, and the website was used as the source of training for that result, and it still came up with the wrong answer. So you can ask the question, are the contexts that are needed to understand a valid explanation actually in your source documents so they can be mined and managed by an LLM for generative AI? I would think that very few corporate repositories have documents that are that highly contextualized. And I've worked in government policy for a number of years in that area, and even there, where you would expect it to be very highly tuned, it would be very hard for an automated system to mine that out. So just to leave you with this, then the challenges, then I'll get off my soapbox, right? The challenge is declarative language. It tends to be very authoritative because it's sucking down a lot of material that's very deliberately and formally written for the internet. Verbosity, it also tends to say more than it probably needs to in some cases, and it doesn't really ask questions very well. And then there have been a number of studies now where they're running tests and finding they get different answers for the same prompts, the same circumstances. And as was mentioned by the keynote this morning, the phrase is actually model collapse for the situation of LLMs beginning to be trained on generative content. And what that does is creates a deteriorating situation in that. And I was reading something yesterday or the day before of the companies really beginning to worry that they're running out of training material because they've swallowed up so much of the internet and they can't continue to train and refine because there's so much noise out there. And then, of course, while it's not necessarily part of your day job, trust can be influenced by people's perceptions from the media and others of where there are challenges with this material. So I want to point you to some things around this question of, so what can we do? And again, these are all frameworks in progress. One is just how we ask questions of others around this area and think about what pieces we're using to help train. Another thing is to really be conscious of the fact that our processes as UX designers, researchers, implementers are changing dramatically. because all of these processes that we do, we've always done them in release cycles. That's not the world anymore. You can build, develop, tune, train. You can then test and test again and release version 1. And then say, "Whew, got that done. We're going to take a week off and come down to Florida. And then we're going to go, and in a few months' time, we'll send out release 2. Because we'll have all this user feedback and other things that we can get. But in the meantime, the tools underneath your feet are evolving continuously through use. And so is it up to us in part to advocate for iterative cycles of tuning and review and understanding of what's going on under the covers inside these models, where we become the users of explanations in order to continuously monitor the evolution of the tools? Over the last few years, I've been working with Carol Smith, which I expect some, if not many of you know. She's at Carnegie Mellon, and she's brilliant, and she works in a lot of areas of ethics. She also works with a lot of autonomous tools, autonomous vehicles, autonomous military equipment, and things that are very spooky and very important for an ethicist to be involved in. And she and I started this conversation in 2020 of saying, how are our methods going to change? What are we going to have to think about? We then involved Rebecca Evanhoe, and if you don't know Rebecca, she's great. Really good. She co-wrote the book Conversations with Things. She's a conversation designer, and she and I have also then been working on this, and the three of us have been working together on this. The first link there is a 2021 presentation that Carol and I did that first kind of brought out our thinking on this. And then the second one was a workshop that Carol and Rebecca and I taught for the Information Architecture Conference that includes some videos on those links of different ways that we were explaining and presenting some of our thinking. But I've mentioned those evolutionary practices in our process that we need to think about. I've been tinkering around for a long while now, from the semantic web days many years ago, on context models and different ways of categorizing and organizing recognition of content. This is just a small example of something that is a many-page taxonomy or ontology around context to begin to say, can I create a model that I can train a machine with to recognize what aspects of context might matter in the situation it's in. And the third area that we've found is really promising is time cycles, which is a way of saying the amount of time from the start of an interaction between human and AI to the completion of a session will have an ongoing dialogue which changes over time. So there are different interactions back and forth that happen between them. And in some cases, there are gaps. And then months later, somebody comes back and the dialogue picks up. And time cycles seems to me promising as a way of modeling that. And of course, what we've gone through today in terms of the poster. I haven't left as much time for questions as I thought, but there is time for questions, and I am around. I don't know if anybody has a microphone, but we've got a question right up there. Hello, was there a...
Anybody has a question?
Here we go. Right there. Yes.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. My name is Bhuvana, and I work in the space of enterprise UX, specifically for government agencies. I actually have many questions, but I will just start with one for now. You talked about fine-tuning AI models iteratively, so that the explanations get better and the data becomes more usable and things of that nature.
Yes.
How do you propose we do that within a delivery context where agile coaches and scrum masters are breathing down our necks, and there's very little time for anything user experience related, let alone training an AI model?
Yes, that is the challenge. I think in the first instance, and I don't have a great answer to that because Agile is not very user-centered in its own right, but it does give you the ability to intervene a little bit by introducing tasks within each sprint where you're revisiting. And so I think it's getting I would say that getting the test team on board with certain types of questions that you are trying to make sure are validating is one area. Because if they're regularly running test cycles that include communication in both directions and not just query response, check the box, we have a response, we're done. We used to have it before a lot of the AI tools. I worked with a lot of search folks in government. And some of the devs were always in the level of, great, a list shows up, perfect. And then they'd move on. Because success, there's something on a page, whether or not it was effective. And so I think getting into the test cycles is probably one area that's going to be particularly important for you. The only other thing I can recommend is there should be a data viz person on the team or your data scientist on your teams for the AI work should be able to look at what they call fitness and actually running analytics on the matches, both the quality of matches with different types of tests to see where the strongest ones are, but also over time rerunning them and comparing them across sprints as well. Those are the two, your test team and your data science team are probably your best allies.
Thank you.
We've got one over here.
So I had a bit of a comment that leads into a question.
Sure.
I was really, I didn't know that there was this very excellent classification system that, I should have assumed there was, but I really like how you explained that there's this notion of a contextual need. That's something that's always occurred to me as kind of lacking in a lot of, what you see in chatbots and whatnot. And I think about the way that conversations organically, naturally happen in the world. And I'm reminded of, I know this seemed like a bit of a ramble, but bear with me. You know how calculators, there's a reverse Polish notation where you have to put the numbers in first and then the operators. And I think to myself sometimes, like, with interfaces, you're often having to do something like RPN, where you're selecting things and you're clicking on interactions. But if you were to interact with the computer like you're having a conversation with a human, your interactions would look very different. The order in which those choices are made, you might not select a bunch of emails and then press a delete button. You might instead say, "Hey, I want to delete some emails." Okay, which ones? These three. Yeah. Oh, actually, just kidding. Can you not that one? I want to keep that one.
Yeah, there are questions of learnability in that, which we do habitually over time.
Right.
But if we're not interacting with the tools on a routine basis and kind of understanding the mental models in which they were built, and that may be where your question was going. I think the biggest challenge with the AI stuff is knowing what were the decisions behind it in terms of how it was built or trained to present information.
Right.
is usually not very apparent to the user.
If you will afford me one like follow-up question, if as designers, when you're interested in this type of thing, it just occurs to me that if you want to be involved in, some of this activity, some of this research with those who are, shall we say, more specialized in the field, most of it is happening in academia. So as somebody who's in the corporate world, how does someone like me find ways of, being more involved in this?
I think you've got a couple things there. So one is a lot of times people are just dropped in it without intending to want to be involved. I ran a workshop a few months ago, and about half the people there are just like, I've just been assigned to something, now what? And so I think there's that side of it.
Yeah.
The other side of it, though, is asking questions. It's sort of how I started getting into working in this area. Was I would just be talking to people and I'd just ask questions. And every once in a while, there'll be a question that lands that somebody's nagging doubt when they're in the middle of that team. They're like, oh yeah, I'm really kind of concerned that I can't get that to be this way.
Right.
And you ask the question, they're like, oh, that's a great question. Yeah, we haven't really figured that out. And now you've opened up your conversation.
Right.
So I think that's the other thing you can do, is just constantly ask questions. When I started working with the Swedes, they were 2 or 3 meetings and they're like, why are you always asking these good questions? Was what it came down to.
I think that's
Thank you. I think we have
all we have time for.
hit our topic.
Thank you very much for insightful talk. It's now 12 o'clock, or a couple minutes after. We were serving lunch next door in the ballroom east. So,
and I'm around.
You can just go up and speak to Dwayne if you have any questions.